Welcome back to another episode of 40 Facts About the 40K Universe. I am your host, Gershwan, and today we continue talking about the Space Marines as we get into the Imperial Fist versus the Iron Warriors in one of their deadliest void battles in history. If you're new to the channel, subscribe. We post Warhammer 40K lore videos every single day. If you have any suggestions for topics, whether they're 40K or 30K, please comment down in the comment section below. And if you enjoy our content, thank our patrons on Patreon. It is because of them that we can do this. Link in the description if you guys want to support us. But with that said, let's get into 40 facts on the Imperial Fist versus the Iron Warriors. No other type of warfare is as unforgiving as void battle. The brutality of ship-to-ship boarding actions coupled with the planet-destroying powers of an Imperial ship make space warfare the deadliest. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and crewmen can be slaughtered in a single second with a perfectly timed land shot. No ship is too large or too fast not to run the risk of being gutted like a fish out of water by enemy fire. And the mind-bending chaos of space battles truly weeds out the weak-willed and incompetent. These types of conflicts is what the Space Marines were built for. Using their superhuman capabilities, they can expertly wage war amongst the stars. This incredible power was showcased during the Great Crusade, when the warriors of the Emperor expertly waged war in the galaxy, but it was during the Horus Heresy where these masters of void tactics collided with one another in terrible and deadly displays of brutal void battle. One of the deadliest conflicts was the Battle of Fao, fought between the Imperial Fist Legion and the Iron Warriors Traitor Legion. When the Primarch Rogol Dorn was given proof of his brother's treachery in the Isfan system by Battle Captain Nathaniel Garro and the crew of the Eisenstein, the Imperial Fist Primarch was filled with an anger that was pulling him towards confrontation with Horus Lupercal. Dorn wished to force the traitor's confession and bring retribution for the treachery he created, but duty had held him back, duty to the Emperor and the Imperium that Horus now sought to destroy. He and his first captain Sigismund set course to return to Terra, but not before Dorn had sent his sons as emissaries of his anger. He had named it a Retribution Fleet. It was 30,000 Imperial Fist Legionnaires, comprised of 300 companies and over 500 warships that struck out towards Isfan III, a third of the 7th Legion, a force great enough to subdue hundreds of worlds, bearing a brother's wrath. Captain Alexis Pollux of the 405th Company was attached to this Retribution Fleet under the command of veteran Captain Yunad, master of the Retribution Fleet. When the fleet had translated back into reality on the edge of the Isfan system, the powers of the warp storm caused gunner fields to fail as hulls sheared into fragments and burned into the fires of their own reactors. Some ships had reached safely, but many had died, their corpses spat out of the warp to freeze in the void. 200 warships were lost, their remains left spinning in the light of a forgotten star. The Imperial Fist had found Captain Pollux in the remains of one of those broken wrecks. He was one of the few survivors. Nearly 10,000 Imperial Fists were gone, a staggering loss that was difficult to grasp. Now only 363 warships remained, a force that was still 1/5 of the 7th Legion's full strength. Yunad had not survived, and since Pollux had been designated as his successor, the right of command for the remaining Retribution Fleet fell to him. Though he felt deeply honored, he also felt completely alone. The truth was that he did not fear the responsibility of such a heavy burden, for Yunad was the Legion's finest fleet master and Captain Pollux his best pupil. But the new fleet master was in doubt that he was the best choice, for there were other men that had survived the wreck of the fleet that were more worthy, commanders with more campaign experience, higher in the roll of honor, and more skilled at arms. But the Imperial Fist followed form and order to the letter, something not easily set aside. The Imperial Fist Warfleet established a base of operations in the Fao system. The 2 habitable planets of Fao were unremarkable agrarian worlds, lightly populated and of no great strategic importance. For reasons they could not ascertain, the warp was calm in this region, and the Imperial Fist found that they could navigate to and from the system with some surety. With their astropaths blind, and as time wore on, the Legion's commanders had grown increasingly frustrated. Though a few amongst the senior captains and battle group commanders might chafe at Pollux's orders, the majority of the fleet's commanders could not fault the young fleet master. The fleet was vulnerable, and an attack was likely. In such a position, one needed to create a solid defense and conserve fighting strength. Pollux's deployment addressed all of these with a direct elegance. The Retribution Fleet formed a sphere close to the ocean world of Fal II. Each commander in the fleet led a battle group of smaller vessels, and every battle group moved on a precision loop course. Together, the whole resembled a cage spun from the tails of comets. Captain Pollux quickly established a routine. While regular scouting missions were launched into the warp, the Legion's astropaths busied themselves with trying to break through the warp storm and make contact with Terra, or in particular, the loyalists of Isfan III. The fleet was kept at full battle stations, and Pollux relentlessly drilled his shield-equipped breacher squads, honing their skills of war like a blade edge made sharper only by harsh practice. They wanted to be prepared in case of any inevitable boarding action. When an enemy came, the Imperial Fist needed to be ready. The opinions of others, whether they agreed with Pollux or not, were of no consequence. Strength required obedience, not thought. Meanwhile, the Primarch Perturabo and his war fleet sat waiting patiently in the Isfan system, awaiting new orders from their War Master. Their patience paid off, as they soon received word from Horus that there were 300 loyalist warships that were caught in a backwatered system like fish in a whirlpool. A fleet of ships pinned in place and waiting for extermination. And here were all of the ship's dispositions and characteristics laid out and listed for them. Though he knew that this was a fleet of one of the mighty Legiones Astartes, this wasn't just an ordinary fleet. This was a fleet composed of the Iron Warriors' most hated rivals, the Sons of Dorn. This information had been gathered firsthand by scout elements in the system, but in the Lord of Iron's mind, he knew that this intel that he received from Horus was too perfect, too neat. How could the War Master have achieved such a thing? It was daunting in its implication. Perturabo realized that this was not a random event. This had been planned before the Iron Warriors had come to kill the weakling legions on Isfan V. But then what else would he expect from the War Master? Perturabo thought of the massacre they had just committed, of the legions they had just butchered. They were weak, and destroying them had been nothing more than another task to be complete. But the Imperial Fists were rivals of old. They were arrogant pretenders. Possibility of breaking Dorn's sons was a prospect so rich that the traitor Primarch could almost taste it. This was obviously a part of the price for their allegiance to Horus, the chance to break one enemy brought by the death of others. The Iron Warriors' captains questioned the Lord of Iron of how they would be able to engage the Imperial Fist through the chaos of a raging warp storm. Perturabo responded that his passage would be possible, for the War Master had guaranteed it. That anyone could have such a guarantee staggered the Primarch's subordinate commanders. Warsmith Forex, one of Perturabo's vaunted triarchs, cautioned the Lord of Iron that if the Imperial Fist suspected the possibility of an attack, they would be prepared. But Warsmith Berosus, the second Grand Company commander, interjected that if the first Captain Sigismund was the one commanding the Imperial Fist fleet, then he would not sit patiently in his cage. Sigismund would make an attempt to break through the warp, making them less prepared and more vulnerable. Perturabo believed that, without a doubt, Sigismund commanded this fleet, for his brother Primarch would not have trusted this fleet to any other. Berosus offered to take his fleet, an equal number of ships, to launch an immediate attack and break the Loyalist fleet. The Lord of Iron struck down the Warmist's request, informing his subordinate commanders that the Imperial Fist must not simply be broken, they must be ground down to nothing. Dorn did not dare come for himself, therefore his favored pups would bleed for him. All of the ships currently under Warsmith Berosus' command would go, but it would be the Lord of Iron who commanded the attack himself. When the surprise assault finally came, the attack led by Perturabo was sudden and overwhelming. From his flagship, the Iron Blood, the Iron Warrior Primarch commanded the first 100 ships that burst into reality at the same moment. The Iron Warrior's vessels brought their weapons to bear, firing as one upon the Imperial Fist vessel, Hammer of Terra. The doomed vessel exploded spectacularly as the enemy salvo set off a chain reaction in the ship's plasma engines. Within seconds of the death of the Hammer of Terra, 12 of its sisters followed, consumed by Nova Shell explosions and torpedo spreads. The Imperial Fist Grand Cruiser, Sulla, fired a single salvo before macro shell fire stripped its shields and its hull became molten slag. The 6 destroyers clustered around it ended in the explosion of its plasma reactor. The Crusader and the Legate lasted scant seconds longer. They and their escorts took a trio of vortex warpheads and vanished into the hunkering dark. 24 Grand Cruisers and battle barges made up the tip of the Iron Warrior's fleet. In close formation around the capital ship, they moved as one. They ran through the debris of their kills, fire and molten metal smearing the prows. Around the Iron Blood, hundreds of warships followed in close formation. Behind them, more pulled themselves from the warp to add to the Iron Warrior's fleet. Initially, the Imperial Fist fleet fragmented under the attack. Flag-wreathed battle barges pulled back, trying to outpace the guns of the Iron Warriors. Heavy cruisers staggered in their flight. the first ones taking fire and then the next, while faster strike cruisers tried to cover the heavier warships as they pulled away. As the Golden Fleet broke into pieces, the Iron Warriors continued to press forward. Smaller ships crippled targets, and then the larger ships delivered the killing blows. It was a methodical and merciless kill, like a siege drill eating through rock. Plunging his fleet into the midst of the Loyalist fleet, Perturabo's strategy was to scatter the Imperial Fist fleet formation and then destroy it piecemeal. His plan was dependent upon the Loyalist ships not being able to fight back quickly enough to break the momentum of his thrust. However, Captain Pollux and his fleet commanders quickly recovered from the shock and the suddenness of Perturabo's attack, and they quickly fought back. Directly in the path of the Iron Warriors, a lone battleship turned to meet its enemy. Forgotten hands had made the Oath of Stone under the light of the sun from Terra. It had been old before it served the Imperium, and it had aged its scars and honored since. Its guns blazed, filling the closing space between it and its enemy with fire. Its target was a grand cruiser that bore the name Setheno. The Iron Warrior ship faltered, its void enveloped, peeling back as it pushed forward through the storm of fire. Lance beams spat from the Oath of Stone, and suddenly the traitor ship was burning, a glowing gouge running from its spade-shaped prow to its fins. The Oath of Stone surged forward to finish the kill, but the Setheno was only one ship amongst the closing fist of iron. 3 heavy cruisers fired. Energy crackled across the Oath of Stone's void shields as they burst like oily bubbles. Shells and missiles hammered the old ship. Its armor cracked and glowed. 100-meter armor plates flaked off its hull. Deep inside the hull, fire ran between compartments, suffocating those that did not burn. A trailing wreckage, the Oath of Stone continued to close and fire on its enemy ship. For a moment, it seemed as if it could face down the might of the entire fleet and survive. Then a line of turbo-blast fire cut its engines in two. Building-sized thrusters fell away as explosions kindled in the wound. With the last of its momentum and guttering engine's power, the Oath of Stone rammed into the enemy ship. It hit the Grand Cruiser in the belly, its prow ramming through the iron ship's spine. The Setheno shuddered, transfixed like a fish on a spear. Gas and fluid sprayed from its hull. For a moment, the two spun locked together in death. Then the Oath of Stone's prow ripped free of the Setheno's hull and pulled the guts of the Grand Cruiser with it. Discarded and dying, the Setheno drifted on, turning end over end, like a broken spear thrown at the night sky. The rest of the Iron Warrior fleet did not even slow down. Around the Iron Blood, hundreds of warships followed in close formation. Months ago, scout units had captured details of the Imperial Fist fleet, each capturing a single snapshot of data and pushing it into the minds of the Astropath slaves for each machine. The Psyker's death screams had cut through the storm, carrying dream images of the Imperial Fist fleet. They had used that data to plan, and that plan was a timetable of obliteration. Perturabo ordered his second captain to scour the Imperial Fist fleet to find where Sigismund lurked. He was to be found, not killed. The honor would belong to the Lord of Iron. The killing continued with murderous rhythm. The ships at the front of the Iron Warriors fleet had begun to split into groups to hunt down smaller Imperial Fist ships. Behind them, fresh arrivals advanced in tight blocks. These were the macro vessels, vast, cliff-sided ships filled with battalions of Iron Warriors and thousands of slave troops. Beside them lurked the Hellburners. These were old-system ships, orbital haulers and tugs. They had ridden through the warp on tethers behind the macro ships. Unstable plasma fuel and munitions filled each of the ramshackled craft. Their slave crew lobotomized into blind obedience. They drove the Hellburners into the throats of the Imperial Fist guns. Many detonated before they reached their victims, but more did not. Chains of explosions formed growing nebulas that hung in the void like lava clotting in the water. The Imperial Fist ships that emerged from these infernos were half dead, their armor peeling from their superstructure, their weapons blind. The macro vessels poured boarding flanks onto the crippled ships as they limped from the firestorm. The Imperial Fist crews did not die swiftly. Swamped by thousands of slaves, they held on until the Iron Warriors came to finish them in person. Dozens of ships died this way, gutted from within and left to drift, their insides filled with the dead of both sides. To the Iron Warriors, the process of victory had begun, and the only question was, how long would it take to complete? The first sign that all was not as it seemed was a bright explosion on the trail edge of the Iron Warriors fleet. The Imperial Fist cruiser, Veritas, and a destroyer wing cut towards their prey. Their target was a grand cruiser, a hulking brute named Calibos. The destroyers released a spread of fast-running torpedoes towards the Iron Warrior ships as they closed. It tried to evade, but was too slow. Blisters of fire opened along its dark metal back. The destroyers accelerated past the injured ship. The Calibos listed drunkenly. Its course veered as the rest of the fleet pulled away. The Veritas struck in an instant later, its dorsal cannons crumpling the Calibos' shields and punching through its carapace. Half dead, it tried to turn its prow towards its attacker, but the Veritas raced past, broadsides raking the Iron Warrior ship. The Grand Cruiser exploded in a shockwave of energy and atomized matter. As the Iron Warrior's fleet responded, the Veritas and its strike group was beyond its reach and turning for its next attack run. It was to be the first blow of many. Despite their long rest at Foul, the Imperial Fist had been kept in a state of constant battle readiness. This policy paid off for the Imperial Fists as they began to concentrate their fire on the leading ships of Perturabo's fleet. It was what months of planning had been for, the hundreds of hours of training. The Retribution fleet was ready to resist an attack, but they faced an enemy far greater than Captain Pollux had ever planned for. The Iron Warriors had taken losses, but their strength remained. If the Imperial Fist had broken in the first moments, they would have died. If they attempted to fight the Iron Warriors head-on, they would have been slaughtered. The Iron Warriors knew their weaknesses, and the Imperial Fist theirs. The Iron Warriors had hoped to find the Loyalists unprepared, but they had not cracked after the first attack. The Imperial Fist defenses had snapped back into place like the cogs of a clockwork mechanism. It was an unfixed fortress made of moving strike groups, fading resistance, and punishing counterattacks. Slower battleships drew fire, pulling Iron Warrior ships out of their formation, while on the edge of the battlesphere, fast strike groups looped around and through the margins of the Iron Warrior fleet. They struck again and again, crippling, destroying, trimming ships from the edge of the enemy fleet like fat carved from meat. The Iron Warrior's fleet was pulling itself apart as it tried to engage the Imperial Fist, and it bled every turn. The Imperial Fist rallied and began to inflict casualties, significant casualties. The Iron Warriors still had greater numbers, but the margin quickly diminished. Commanded by the Imperial Fist 14th Company Commander, Captain Amandus Tyr guided the vessel Halcyon through the battle storm, its leaf-bladed hulls glowing with reflected light from explosions and weapon fire. The void was thick with debris and plasma clouds, tumbling together like blood and entrails sinking through the water. The Halcyon fired as it dove, prow and dorsal weapons thrusting ahead of its path. Behind it, two of its sister ships followed, Unity and Truth. They were smaller, knife blades to the Halcyon's spear tip. They spun, their flank batteries spiraling a bright helix around them as they sliced through the Iron Warrior fleet. This near to the core of the Iron Warrior formation, the hulls of the enemy ships were so close that the gunners could aim by sight. The Halcyon and its escorts relied on raw speed and aggression to keep them alive. Though the Imperial Fist had lost 2 ships in 3 passes, they had managed to kill 4 times as many. As the Halcyon continued its attack run, it approached the Iron Warrior battlecruiser, Dominator. The Halcyon rotated on its axis, swooping under the Dominator, its flank batteries firing. The belly of the Iron Warrior ship split open in a string of explosions. The Unity and Truth followed close behind the Halcyon, hammering into the gaping gut wound in the Dominator's hull. It disintegrated, plasma from its ruptured heart burning from within. The Halcyon arced away from its kill, engines clawing for speed as it aimed for the edge of the battlesphere. Suddenly, an Iron Warrior battle barge came out of the surrounding swirl of battle. The Unity vanished in a spread of detonations. As the Halcyon came out of its attack run, Captain Tyr spied a massive vessel, 15 kilometers of cold iron and battle-blackened adamantium. This vessel was the oldest daughter of the ship forges of Olympia, a breaker of fleets and planets, the Iron Blood. Tyr knew that only one being had ever been her master, the Lord of Iron. The Imperial Fist commander ordered the Vox Master to get a signal to Fleet Master Pollux to warn him that Perturabo was here. When Tyr informed the Fleet Master of Perturabo's flagship leading the enemy fleet, the captain did not expect the response that he received. Pollux immediately placed 50 ships under Tyr's command. The Iron Warrior's fleet was bleeding, but it wasn't enough. Not enough for Pollux, not enough for his lost battle brothers, not enough for a blood prize for betrayal. Tyr's objective was the Iron Blood. He was to execute Perturabo. Captain Tyr led an assault force of 53 Terminator-clad veterans to assault the Lord of Iron's flagship. Going to go into battle against another legion, against a Primarch. It was a battle none of them had ever thought they would fight, but there was no doubt or hesitancy amongst them. Pollux had ordered the strike against Perturabo, and that was surprising to Tyr. He had thought that his brother lacked the boldness of such a gambit. This might be his last mission, but it didn't matter. That was the nature of war. The Imperial Fist knew that death was often the price for victory. The Imperial Fist concentrated their fire on the leading ship of Perturabo's fleet. The impact of this was devastating to the traders, as their leading ships were torn apart in the firestorm. As the leading ships were battered, the following ships of Perturabo's fleet broke off their attack to regroup. This gave the Loyalists the chance to go on the offensive, but before they did so, the fleet's astropaths relayed a critical message to the loyal commander. Finally, they had succeeded in making contact with Terra, and the Imperial Fist had urged orders to return there, by the will of the Primarch Rogodorn. These orders came with the highest priority. The Imperial Fists were not to let anything delay them. Coincidentally, a passage seemed to have somehow opened up in the storm, though the Imperial Fists were not sure how long this would last. If they were to obey the Primarch's orders, they had to withdraw while there was still a chance to make it through the storm. Embattled against the traitors of Perturabo and his Iron Warrior Legion, the Loyalists had an opportunity to force the issue and launch a counterattack against Perturabo's fleet, perhaps dealing a wound to the enemy so severe that the Iron Warriors might never recover. But they had their orders. It was the will of Rogodorn that they return post-haste. When it came, the order to withdraw spread like poison through the Imperial Fist fleet. The first to run were the smaller craft, the frigates, the gunboats, and the strike cruisers. Alone or in small squadrons, 130 of the proudest warships of the Imperium fled the sphere of battle. Every Imperial Fist on every ship knew what the fleet master was doing and why. It was a judgment of who was most likely to survive. It was also a death sentence for those that remained. Behind the fleeing ships, their heavier cousins fired on the enemy with renewed fury. Rolling fire hit every Iron Warrior ships within range, clouding their sensors with a haze of energy as munitions detonated against the void shields. It worked for a while, until the first of the Imperial Fists dropped into the warp. For a moment, nothing changed. Then more of the fleeing ships vanished. The Iron Warriors realized what was happening. They fell on the breaking Imperial Fist like starved jackals on wounded lions. A second wave of Imperial Fist craft began to run from the system's edge. The Lacedaemon, the ship that carried the first Imperial Fist beyond the Sol system, was the first to break away. Its captain, the obedient Lagos, pushed the ship until its engines blew raw plasma. 12 Iron Warrior ships ran him down, raking the Lacedaemon with constant fire. With its hull blasted to twisted ruin, the Lacedaemon fired back on its killer until the last inch of its hull's integrity gave out. Of the rest of the second wave of retreat, a handful made it to clear space and jumped into the warp. Most followed the Lacedaemon's death, however. The battle had become a slaughter. The Imperial Fist were running. Squadrons of ships tried to keep the Iron Warriors at bay, while the others made it for clear space and the possibility of escape. Freed of the pressure of attack, the Iron Warriors fell on them. Every passing instant saw another ship die under the Iron Warriors' guns. They simply hammered them into twisted metal and cooling slag. There was an abandonment to it, a wasteful brutality that required no skill, but the Imperial Fist died just the same. The Contrador and Pollux's command ship, the Tribune, met in an embrace of fire and punctured metal. The Tribune fired every remaining weapon at the closing Iron Warrior ship. Macro shells, lance beams, and plasma jets flickered across the narrowing distance and broke over the Contrador's shields. The return fire blew out the Tribune's gun deck and gouged a long wound in its side. The Contrador closed until it was drifting alongside the Tribune's wounded flank. Assault pods and boarding torpedoes slid across the gap. A weak flurry of turret fire reached out to meet the swarm of assault craft and hammered a handful into the wreckage. The rest came on, unconcerned and undeterred. They hit in a wave, punching through gold-plated armor and disgorging their cargo into the guts of the Tribune. Though Pollux knew that the Tribune was as good as dead, he would claim its death prize. With the Tribune lost, Pollux ordered the remaining units aboard to withdraw and jump to Terra as ordered. On the external hull of the Tribune, 100 assault crafts boosted into the void like a cloud of fireflies. The Tribune's contingent of Imperial Fists left their fortress for the very last time. The 30 members of Pollux's personal strike force were still with him, waiting. Before he departed, he nodded to the engineers. There was a flash of light, and the Tribune's teleport chamber vanished from around him. Precisely 5 seconds later, the engineers performed their last duty. They never questioned the fleet master's order, never showed the slightest doubt or emotion at what was asked of them. The Tribune's plasma reactors were overloaded. For a second, the Tribune held its form, a golden fortress floating in black night. Then it detonated. The Imperial Fists still on board were vaporized, and their Iron Warrior enemies with them. Tongues of plasma flicked out from the sun-hot core. Vast lumps of armor plating rode on the growing spheres of hot gases. The blast wave hit the Contrador and broke fields and burnt its sensors and rangefinders. Imperial Fist attack craft descended upon it moments later, like a vengeful spirit of the dead. The killing began to slow. The Retribution fleet was no more. Only the crippled and dead remained. The Iron Warrior ship had stopped firing on their victims, as if the overwhelming firepower of the earlier battles had spent them. The surrounded Imperial Fist remnants fired all they had at the face of the enemy. Some managed to strip the void shields off the Iron Warrior ships. Some even managed to wound their hulls. But the Iron Warriors came on, shrugging off damage like a bullgrox trampling a dog in the dirt. They swarmed on their enemies, their boarding pods clutching the golden hulls like ticks feeding on cattle. Their boarding party struck plasma reactors, shutting them down and letting the ships choke to death without power. Life support systems, artificial gravity, and weapon systems went silent. Then the Iron Warriors left, and the cold of the void reached into the lightless hulls to do its slow and silent work. A few Imperial ships remained, fighting to the last, a shrieking cluster of resistance that became smaller and smaller by the second. They fought to the death, firing on the enemies with undimmed fury, covering limping comrades, even as the Iron Warriors brought them down. When the Tribune exploded amongst the last Imperial ships, few of the Iron Warriors even took note. The Contrador had killed it, and the Primarch had had the head of the Imperial Fist who dared to stand against him. However, the Contrador lingered on the side of its victory. Of course, it drew no suspicions from the Iron Warriors. Unbeknownst to the traitors, Captain Pollux and his strike force managed to fight their way to the Contrador's bridge and take control of the Iron Warrior ship. Pollux ordered the Contrador to depart. As the Iron Warrior's vessel's engines fired to full life, it moved away from the debris of its battle with the Tribune. Though the ship was severely damaged inside and out, half of its crew dead, and its command seized by the enemy, it was still able to run. By the time the rest of the Iron Warrior fleet realized something was wrong, the Contrador was already beyond their range. Its engines breathed comet trails as it made for the edge of the foul system. Deaf to the signals that followed its flight, the Iron Warriors pursued until the Contrador ripped a glowing hole in the starfield and drove into the storm beyond. The Imperial Fist fleet was now completely gone. Some had managed to flee and jump into the warp, but most drifted in the void, shattered and blackened. The forces that had boarded the Iron Blood were now dead to a man. The final dozen or so Imperial Fist Terminators that had miraculously gone to the flagship's bridge were slaughtered by the hands of the Lord of Iron himself. Their broken bodies lay scattered across his command throne. There was no enemy left to fight. Meanwhile, the Contrador struggled to break through the violent warp storm, whose frustrated fury raged on the hulls of the Iron Warrior's vessel. Some of the human crew had died, for there had been violence. Some of the crew had still held loyal to their Iron Warrior masters, but their futile attempts were quickly put down by the resolute and grim Imperial Fists. Others died of hunger, their bodies withering away to nothing. Their time in the warp was impossible to measure, for time was inconsequential within the Immaterium. After an undeterminate time within the warp, the Imperial Fist navigators finally discovered a way through the storm, detecting the faint luminescence of the Holy Astronomicon. Using this holy light, the ship's navigators guided the Contrador back to Terra. But much to their shock, the surviving Imperial Fist emerged from the raging warp storm into a system not unlike their own. Weapon platforms and void stations ringed the planets in heavy chains as ships moved through the void. The forces gathered there were the greatest ever seen amongst the surviving Astartes. It was a star system made into a fortress, a seat of power and unbending might. Captain Pollux and the Imperial Fist had not arrived in the Sol system. They had arrived in the realm of Ultramar. And those were 40 facts on the Imperial Fist versus the Iron Warriors. I hope you guys enjoyed. More videos like this to come, so subscribe to the channel or tell your friends. Share it on Facebook, Reddit, all that kind of stuff. Thanks for listening, guys, and I will talk to you tomorrow. This was Gershwan with One Mind Syndicate signing out.